It's a Darkness Prevails classic. Werewolves. The monster that scarred me for life when I was a kid, because I watched certain movies I shouldn't have been allowed to see yet, and now look at me, telling scary stories for a living. Today we've got allegedly true stories about werewolf sightings, from night drives gone wrong to a werewolf found in Yellowstone National Park. I think you're gonna have plenty to be scared of today. Enjoy! And remember to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org to have them narrated. Also, let me know in the comments what kind of extra long compilation you want to hear next. Maybe 5 hours of night shift stories or something else. Time for the comment of the day. This comes from my last episode about a scary story from Mount Fuji and other assorted tales. A user named Golgo13 writes, "In the first story, when the people were talking about hearing a scream in the forest, my neighbors started arguing and I had my window open at the time. Scared the heck out of me." My reply? They were probably arguing about which horror narrator is the best. It's a pretty sensitive and heated topic. If you want me to reply to your comment, leave an interesting one in this video and I might choose yours. Now then, let's begin. A Midnight Drive from Rantix. Sometimes I drive to take the edge off of a stressful evening. It's even good to help me get back to sleep. I spend my days working at a desk and live in the nearby mountains. Being stuck in an office all day, with little time to myself afterwards, leaves me yearning to do a little hiking or driving, especially since the area I live in is so scenic. I also have a lot of trouble sleeping at times. If I wake up in the middle of the night and I can't get back to sleep, I'll walk down to my garage, then take a 10-minute drive around the mountain listening to talk show podcasts through the stereo. I don't really have many neighbors, and the craziest thing to happen is usually some deer walking across the road. So basically, the most I'd have to worry about out there would be a random deer running into the side of my car. I can't say I wouldn't mess myself if that happened out of nowhere. One night I went to bed around 9:30. I was exhausted. Funny how you can be so tired after a long day of just typing on a computer. Irritatingly, I woke up a couple of hours later. When I checked my phone, it was around midnight. Firstly, I tried to turn over and go back to sleep, but after 15 minutes I felt wide awake, yet my body still felt so exhausted. I sighed and pulled myself up out of bed and walked to the garage. In moments, I was pulling out of my driveway with my high beams on. I drove down my gravel road until I hit pavement. Then I took a left on the road that circles the mountain and eventually leads me to a turn that goes back to my house. I like to take it slow. The speed limit signs say 25, but I usually go just 20. Circling the mountain on this road usually takes me about 15 minutes. Not too long, not too short. I was listening to the guys on this podcast arguing over whether or not the mom from Malcolm in the Middle was hot, when I suddenly saw something in the road up ahead. It looked like a little mound of something. It didn't seem to be moving. I came to a full stop about 15 feet away from it. Whatever it was, it sat there in the middle of the road. I could easily go around it, but my curiosity was piqued. I was wondering if this was one of my distant neighbor's dogs or something. Poor thing might have gotten run over. But with how large it was, and how messy and long the fur was, the only way this could be my neighbor's dog was if they had a massive Irish wolfhound. Slowly, I convinced myself that it had to be some sort of dog. We didn't have wolves around here, and it didn't seem to be a mountain lion or bear. I eventually did convince myself it had to be one of my neighbor's dogs. Then I began to wonder, if this was my dog in the middle of the road, possibly dead after having been run over, wouldn't I want someone to tell me, or even bring it back? With yet another sigh, I decided I was going to get out of the car and approach this mound of unmoving fur. I opened my car door and stepped out in my loafers. Slowly, I shuffled towards this furry thing. I kept a good eye on it, observing it, making sure it wasn't moving. In my head, the worst-case scenario would be it was a bear and it would wake up when I got to it and run away scared from me, and I'd run away scared back to my car. But that's definitely not a fright I wanted, so I was approaching it as cautiously as possible. Eventually, I was standing over it, looking down. I remember almost choking from the sudden gasp I made. The face was definitely the face of a large dog. It had pointed ears and a very long snout, which lay opened on the pavement, the tongue spewed out and laying on the road. Dozens of extremely sharp and large teeth were shown clearly due to the way its mouth hung open. I was absolutely astonished. This thing didn't have front legs. Those were arms, I swear to God. They looked exactly like a grown man's arms covered in hair, and the back legs seemed overly long and way too bent, like an exaggerated version of a dog's. I was both amazed and absolutely confused. I didn't know what I was looking at. Was this a dog? Some sort of weird bear? Maybe whatever it used to be got hit by the car so hard, it just mangled it and made it look like, well, this. When you see something so crazy, sometimes your mind will struggle to make sense of it, and it believes anything else besides what you're actually thinking deep down. After all, who hasn't seen a horror film with a werewolf in it? Way back in my mind, I knew that what I was looking at seemed familiar. I'd seen things similar to this in movies. But those were movies, I told myself. Nothing like that could be real. My mouth was open as I stared at it. I didn't see any blood. No sign of injury. Suddenly, a gnat or mosquito or something flew right down my throat, apparently trying to become part of my respiratory tract. I choked and coughed it up. I'd taken my eyes off the creature for only a moment. Still only a couple of feet away, I looked back down and nearly screamed. The creature in the road had turned and raised its head and was staring at me. Its head was bobbing a little bit to the side, and it didn't open its eyes all the way. I took a step backward, when suddenly, the creature snapped with its mouth at my closest leg. Thankfully, it missed by a wide margin. I ran like a scared child back to my car. I slammed the door shut, and I hit the lock button like 20 times. By the time I looked ahead at the creature in the road, it had picked itself up and it stood on 2 legs. I remember thinking, you have to be freaking kidding me. Part of me wanted to believe I was still at home, sleeping in my bed, and this was just some nightmare. I watched as this thing that fully resembled a werewolf stumbled off and to the left, which would have been up the mountain, closer to where I lived. It walked off the road and disappeared into the trees. A few seconds after I couldn't see it any longer, I floored it down that road. I didn't go back home just yet. When I came to the turn that would circle me back towards my house, I went the other way towards town. The thing is, I live alone in that house, and seeing it take off in the direction of my property, I was a little too creeped out to go back home. Sorry if that makes me sound like a wuss. I wanted to be around other people for a while. I don't think I was going back to sleep that night anyway. I found a Waffle House, ordered a coffee and some hash browns, and just sat there. I kept getting refills of my coffee, and I tried to wait it out until sunrise. After being there for about an hour, though, the waitresses seemed to be looking and talking about me, probably wondering why I was there so long. But they didn't say anything to me. A few hours after that, I left for home, eyes completely wide, making sure that I didn't see anything weird on the roadsides. That was my experience. It was extremely terrifying for me. That was the last thing I ever thought I'd see on the road, and it quickly made me stop my midnight or late night drives for good. I've never gone back out on the road at night, not unless I absolutely had to. There have been moments when my friends convinced me to go on late night drives with them, on road trips and such, but I begged them not to make me drive after dark, and even when I'm not driving, I'll sit there in the passenger seat and panic a little bit on the inside, my stomach in knots from anxiety. Maybe I'm making too much of a big deal about this. I don't know. But I do know a few things. One, that was no normal animal. It was real and looked exactly like a werewolf would. 2, it tried to bite me. And 3, I think the only reason it didn't hurt me was because it was stunned or dazed. I think someone had hit it with their car. That's why it was lying there in the middle of the road. That's why its eyes weren't fully open and why its head was bobbing. That's why it didn't run away, but stumbled away off the road. So the thought I'm left with after all of this is this thing could have mauled me to death, but it wasn't able to because someone hit it with their car. If I'd found this thing in better condition, it terrifies me to think of what would have happened to me. Werewolf of Yellowstone, from Terror Former. A few years ago, I took a camping trip with my girlfriend at the time to Yellowstone National Park. I'd saved up some vacation days, and I was hoping to propose to my girlfriend on this trip. Being that both of us were nature freaks and loved hiking and camping, this just made sense to me. We arrived at the start of our designated trail on a foggy Saturday morning. Things got weird pretty fast. We'd only been walking the trail for a few minutes when we heard something big run through the undergrowth just off the path. The two of us stopped. Lynn, my girlfriend, turned to me and asked, "Did you hear that?" "Yeah, didn't see it though. Did you?" "No, it sounded huge," she replied. "Are there moose in Yellowstone? Or bears?" I laughed. "Yeah, there are both. I doubt it was either though, probably just deer. Those are way more common." I'd been to Yellowstone before, but Lynn hadn't. I didn't want her to feel scared right off the bat. Plus, I was being truthful. There were tons of deer out in Yellowstone, at least in my experience. Bears and moose are far less common. And between you and me, I'd rather it be a bear than a moose. We kept walking for a couple of hours, taking a few breaks to take pictures, enjoying the scenery and eating an early lunch. It didn't take long after our last break to make it to the campsite. Lynn helped me pitch the tent and we got a small fire pit going. "Hey, there's a creek down there." She pointed down the hillside. I looked down past the rows of pine trees. Sure enough, I caught the shimmer of a little stream. "I'm gonna go wash my feet," Lynn said. She didn't wait for a reply before carefully making her way down the hill. I replied anyway. "All right, be careful. Don't use any soap in that water, it's a national park." "I won't," she called back. "I just want to wash off this dirt." I smirked. She wouldn't have gotten dirt in her shoes if she had let me buy her new ones. The pair she had on had to be a couple of years old by now, with a few holes on each shoe. Lynn had always been the type to hold on to things until she had gotten all the use out of them that she could. While she did her thing, I unfolded a chair and sat down. It felt good to finally take a load off. Walking uphill for a couple of hours ain't no joke. We woke up early that morning too, so I found myself dozing off in no time. Suddenly, Lynn screamed. I shot straight up out of the chair. "Lynn?" I called out. When I got no response, I ran down the hill, careful not to fall and roll the rest of the way. I found her at the edge of the stream with one shoe on. Her other shoe sat at the edge of the stream. "You okay? What happened?" I asked her. Without turning to me, she shook her head and stuttered. I was just sitting by the water when something jumped and landed literally right next to me in the stream. It was huge and black. It splashed me because it landed on the water, then just ran off." "What?" I smiled. "Sounds like you spooked an animal and didn't know it. Probably didn't even see you until it was next to you." "Are there wolves out here, Taylor? Or wild dogs?" Lynn looked around. She was frantic in her movements. "Wild dogs? I don't think so. I could be wrong, though. As for wolves, yeah, but there are so few of them, I doubt that's what it was." "Taylor, I saw it. It was way bigger than me, with dark fur, and it looked like a wolf." "Oh, that's scary. But, hon, if it was a wolf, I wouldn't worry. They're scared of people, hence why it ran off like that. I explained to her to make her feel better. I wasn't sure she saw a wolf. Odds were it was something else entirely, but I didn't want to be a jerk and tell her it was nothing. "Okay," she said, finally calming down. She turned towards me. "Would you please grab my other shoe?" "Sure, babe," I chuckled. "It's not funny, I'm seriously scared." She half smiled and punched me in the shoulder. I know, we're gonna be just fine." I grabbed the shoe and gave it to her, then followed her back up the hill. We settled into our campsite for a while. It was only midday by then, or close to it. Lynn read a book. She was really into true crime novels. I wasn't much into reading, but I did love to listen to her tell me about her books when she was done. Way more fun of a way to enjoy a book, for me anyway, hearing the story from someone who's really excited about it. While she did that, I checked the cooler. We had plenty of ice still, to keep the drinks cool until the afternoon. We'd only brought bottles of water to drink, so even without the ice, we'd be fine drinking warm water. We had hot dogs in there too, but by the time the ice melted, we'd have already eaten them. After that, I grabbed my knife and the hunk of wood from my bag. I'd been whittling an eagle for the past week. I wasn't very good at whittling, but it was a really fun way to pass the time. A while later, I asked Lynn, "You up for some fishing?" "Yeah," she replied. "I'd rather catch something than have hot dogs for dinner, even if that means they end up spoiling." "Same, actually," I said, getting up and stretching. We grabbed our fishing gear and carried along the trail ahead. I'd been here before, so I knew there was a medium-sized pond not too far away. Maybe just a 10-minute walk from the campsite. Before long, we could see the pond. We were maybe 20 yards from it when I stopped, because straight ahead of me, I heard growling. "Hold on, babe." I raised my arm to make sure she stopped. "What is that?" she whispered. "I don't know. Sounds like a dog." "Or wolf," she interrupted matter-of-factly. We stayed still for a moment. The growling was definitely coming from up ahead of us. There was some overgrown weeds and grass to get through before we made it to the pond, so whatever it was, it must have been hidden in there. For a second, I was afraid we'd stumbled upon a bear or, heck, even a wolf that was eating. Otherwise, I wouldn't think those sorts of animals would bother us. "Throw a rock at it," Lynn whispered to me. "I don't know about that. I don't want to bend over and make myself look any smaller." "Hey!" I began to wave my arms as high in the air as I could while shouting. I kept thinking, this is what you do in case of an animal encounter, right? Make yourself loud and big and scary to them. "Go on, get out of here!" Well, that did work, but not in the way I was expecting. The thing revealed itself, standing to full height out of the weeds, which were only a few feet tall because we could look over them and see the pond. I heard Lynn gasp behind me, dropping her fishing pole. I watched unbreathing as the head of a wolf rose out of those weeds to 4 feet, 5 feet, no, 6 feet off the ground, if not more. It walked sideways, leering at us with its head lowered. An unexpected arm, covered in fur, reached out and latched on to a nearby young tree. Then the creature pulled its weight towards the tree as it began to walk off to the left, where the brush was thickest. Obviously, it wasn't a wolf or any animal I'd ever seen. "What in the world was that?" Lynn said, when we could no longer hear the thing walking. "I have no idea," was all I could say. I turned around and I began to walk back up the trail. "I think we should leave," I told her. She nodded in total agreement. She turned to go back up the trail too, when a sound echoed behind us. A dreadful, terrible sound, heavy footsteps coming right towards us. "Run," I told Lynn. I dropped my rod and tackle box and ran too, making sure to keep myself behind her. Why was it chasing us now, I wondered. But then I realized I had turned my back on the creature when I thought it was gone. Though we couldn't see it anymore, it must have still been watching us. It didn't take long before I could hear it snarling as it chased us. I think Lynn was crying. I was covered in chills. I don't think I'd ever been so afraid. I searched my pocket for my whittling knife and opened it. It was tiny, but it was the most I had to defend myself. Quickly, we made it back to the camp. "Don't stop," I told Lynn. "Back to the car." We passed the campsite. I listened behind us as the footsteps and snarling stopped at the camp. My guess was the campsite had our scent in it, so it was either cautious or curious of it. Not to mention I'd left the cooler with the water bottles and hot dogs in it, so maybe it was going to enjoy our dinner. As long as it wasn't us, I told myself. But we ran for another 45 minutes or so, before making it back to the car and practically collapsing in it. Without a word, we drove away. When we got back to our apartment later that night, we discussed the event. We both agreed on what we saw. A monster of a creature that looked very much like a wolf, except it was too large and somehow had arms instead of front legs. I was still shaken up pretty bad, but I was also extremely relieved. You see, I'd kept the ring for the proposal in my bag at the campsite up until we got up to go fishing. If I hadn't decided to stick it into my pocket just as we got up to go fishing, it would have wound up abandoned at that camp. The thought of going back there to look for it scared me because I knew I would force myself to go back anyway. Thankfully, it was still in my pocket. Lynn and I are happily married now with a baby on the way. And you bet your butt I'm gonna be telling our kid this story. My friend's encounters with the Dogman. From Sneeves0328 on Discord. A few months back, one of my friends opened up to me about a creature he said he encountered 2 times around New Jersey, where my mother lives. This same friend and I believe we encountered a skinwalker in the past, while in New Jersey, and he told me when he was just a boy, he saw something in the fields next to his house. Whatever he saw still terrifies him to this day. He's had 2 encounters with this creature, one in the middle of the day when he was a boy, and one waking up in the middle of the night. Here are his encounters with an alleged Dogman. These will be told from his perspective. I've lived in New Jersey all my life. Since I was a kid, I've had all sorts of paranormal and unexplained creature encounters. I'm a heavy believer in the supernatural. I believe in dogmen and other cryptids. Well, something happened on a clear sunny day as I was walking alongside a trail that was close to my house. I was only about 7 or 8 years old at the time. It was so beautiful out, and as a young kid, I was just taking it all in. I was having an adventure, picturing myself just running through the open fields waiting for Mom and Dad to get home. The trail I was on had wonderful scenery all around. Tall grass and miles of fields to my left and dense forest to my right. I was just walking through the woods as whenever my parents weren't home, that's what I would do. The smell of the woods and the chirping of the birds, it was all so intoxicating. But then, the woods around me fell silent. It felt as if someone or something was watching me, and my eyes darted around the entire area. I looked over to my left, and I noticed something in the tall grass. To me, it looked like a big dog, but then I realized it was crouched down like a man would be if he were trying to hide in the grass. This animal was covered in brown fur, and it seemed to have a muzzle and ears similar to that of a German Shepherd. Its eyes were red. I was mostly curious at the time, but I was on edge, scared just enough that I acted like I didn't notice it, and I just went along my day, soon starting to run back to my house. I never spoke about this encounter with any of my family, as they'd think I'm crazy, but that was my first encounter with what I believed to be a Dogman. The second encounter only happened about 4 or 5 years ago. At this point, I lived in a different house. This house was close to a large forest, and the biggest predators I'd seen around there had been either coyotes or foxes. However, what I saw that night was no coyote. I woke up in the middle of the night with my throat dry, and I needed to get a drink. I went to the kitchen to get some water when I felt a sudden sense of dread. It felt as if I was being watched. I looked into the window close to where I was, and, to my horror, I saw this huge animal in my backyard. Whatever it was, it noticed me, and it was staring at me with these red eyes. I felt utterly terrified. I saw the animal bare its teeth at me and stand up on 2 legs. The creature began to growl. I could hear it clearly as my window was slightly open. I also saw its breath coming out of its mouth, and I understood this was real. The animal before me was in fact real. It looked to be about 7 to 8 feet tall on both legs, with the head of a German Shepherd and a body shaped like a bodybuilder. Whatever it was, it looked at the fence suddenly, then ran off towards it, then jumped across it into the woods below. I went back to my bed, terrified. I couldn't sleep at all that night. These 2 encounters with these beings have shaken me to my core and made me understand there are creatures that science refuses to recognize. The Curious Dogman of Waha Woods. From Travis the Hunter. This happened about 2 years ago. It was the first odd thing to happen to me. I was an outdoorsy kid, and my grandparents had brought me up to their cottage for a week. The first few days were fine. We went fishing, swimming, and all that fun stuff. But the last 3 days were the worst. I was outside practicing with my bow for when I go hunting. I brought my bow back inside, and I told my grandparents that I'd be taking a nap on the rocks behind the cottage. I don't know how long I napped for. When I came to, it was getting late. My grandparents made dinner, so I went back inside and we ate. And later we went to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I checked my watch, which I could read in the dark. It read 3 a.m. When I looked around me, I noticed I was outside again. How did I wake up outside, I wondered. I was confused, but then I heard a low howl, the lowest howl I'd ever heard. It sounded like a bison and a wolf mixed. I was horrified when I heard that, but what I would see next would make me tear up. There was something barely illuminated by the dim moon, a giant gray wolf-looking creature. It walked out from behind a giant cedar tree. It stood there on its hind legs and began to walk towards me. It seemed curious. I sat there petrified. I felt that if I got up, its predator instincts would kick in, and it would chase me all the way to the front door if I could make it there. So I stayed there in fear, wondering if I was going to die. But then it began to sniff me, and after that, I think I blacked out, because when I woke up again, I was in a hut that I didn't recognize. I was covered in dirt and my head was aching. As soon as I remembered that creature, I got up and ran back to the cottage, crying, because I know I could have died. I could have been eaten by that thing. I ran as fast as I could, just to feel some sort of safety. Keep in mind, I was not a very fit-looking kid. I had beefy legs and wasn't able to run very far without feeling sick. When I burst through the tree line, I found myself by the Trans-Canada Highway. I cried, but then I heard something coming from the forest behind me. I stood my ground, waiting for that thing to lunge out at me. Instead of that creature, I was greeted by a warden who was looking for me and saw me running through the woods. I burst into tears and laughed but that was followed by me throwing up because I'd been running for so long. I took a couple of minutes to breathe, and I told the warden to follow me. I showed him where I woke up, the little hut I'd run away from. He looked as pale as a ghost. He screamed to get behind him, but as soon as I got behind him, I heard this howl, the same one I'd heard the night before. The warden held tight to his 12 gauge. Then that creature from before walked out from the hut. He fired at it, and it took off into the forest so fast, I have no idea if he actually hit it. Seemingly as scared as I was, the warden bent down and asked me if that was what took me. I nodded my head, signaling yes. He walked me down to the search party camp where my grandparents had been sitting and waiting for the warden to give them good news. They ran to me, and I'd never seen my grandpa cry before. He was a bold and stern man who always seemed serious. I told them what happened. They were just glad I was okay. But a warden pointed out that I had marks on my back and legs. All in all, I was okay. I would soon learn I'd been missing for 2 days. Within 45 minutes, my grandparents brought me to the nearest hospital in North Bay, where I stayed the night, and my grandpa stayed in the truck while grandma stayed in the hospital with me. The next morning, the nurse came into the room and told us it was a miracle that I was able to walk already, and that I had no bite marks. I went home with painkiller. Yet now I'm forever scarred, thanks to that night and those claws.